Thank you so much. First of all, thanks to Lauren and everyone who came here today and the judges. Thanks to everyone here for sticking in here for so long. I know I'm the last one. It's been a few hours now. But I think we're going to touch on a couple of the issues that actually have underlied a lot of the things that we've spoken about today, and that's personal responsibility and the role of government. And I think the way in which we can fashion our communities and our individuals in order to promote that. So Buckley once said, "I will not cede more power to the state. I will not willingly cede more power to anyone. Not to the state, not to General Motors, not to the CIO. I will hoard my power like a miser, resisting every effort to drain it away from me." In this sense, power belongs where it originates, in the individual and his ability to use it to his own benefit. But Buckley also believed in the power of community, to group together willingly to accomplish greater goals. That's one of the reasons why we live in a state, to accomplish these goals that are greater than any individual. But today, the US government has an unprecedented amount of power. It's justified by the necessity of these goals that are beyond an individual's power, that only a state can accomplish. But Buckley and others like him serve as a constant reminder to mind the implications of that transfer of power away from the individual and towards the state. In the following few minutes, I'd like to present two arguments. I'd like to begin with an ideological one, to prove the necessity of removing some of that power away from the state and towards the individual. Then I will argue, based on pragmatism and efficiency, which I hope you'll argue with me about, for a proposal that will return this power back to individuals while still maintaining the public good that we have come to expect out of our government and out of our society. And to do so, I will focus the debate on an often forgotten hallmark of conservatism, which is the community and our social institutions. These are the ways in which individuals get together to accomplish these goals, to pool their resources in a willing way and democratic and free way in order to accomplish these greater goals. Alfred J. Nock, a friend and mentor of Buckley, wrote in his book, My Enemy the State, "If we look beneath the surface of our public affairs, we can discern one fundamental fact, namely a great redistribution of power between society and the state. Price fixing, wage fixing, inflation all come to the same thing, which is an increase of state power and the corresponding decrease of social power. Therefore, every assumption of state power, whether by gift or by seizure, leaves society with so much less power. There is never, nor can there be, any strengthening of state power without a corresponding and roughly equivalent depletion of social power. Under statehood, individuals must sacrifice certain liberties and privacy for the sake of the common good. War, foreign diplomacy, and other absolute needs are jobs of the federal government that everyone can agree on. These are the few and defined that our founders spoke of. But Nock identifies a loss beyond the particular rights or monies that we give up. That is social power. The more power the government holds, the less society does. Every time we allow the government to take that role, we lose it ourselves. And as the government has expanded, we have lost more and more of that. So Nock's critique isn't just aimed at the scale of government, but what the assumption of big government has made the citizenry of the United States take for granted. The government is the primary vehicle for all of success and virtue and all that is good, not the people and the communities within our country. The most important and devastating part of this is how this has affected our view of responsibility. This decrease of power is so insidious because we as a community abdicate accountability for these essential responsibilities. This is true both on a technical level, but also on a psychological level. If there is a natural disaster, a need for better schools to be built, better museums, libraries, solutions to homelessness, no matter what it is, the immediate response is to ask why the government isn't doing a better job at solving these. Why aren't they taking care of these responsibilities? No one asks what our spot beyond any of this, besides for social media or our own limited charity that we can. And why shouldn't we? They're the ones we've placed in charge of all these, the government. They're the ones who are given such an important amount of power, but also funding to do all this. High taxes only exacerbate this problem. If we are paying so much, we expect results to correspond to the amount we are paying. But more than that, we lose the ability to tackle these problems ourselves. When we have already given all of our resources that we can to the government, we are left with little of our own. We don't look to our neighbor, we don't look to our family, we don't look to our communities to solve these important problems. We only look to the government. So that's the state of our community. The public has ceded control of almost every sector of life, and the government has become the only source for our collective efforts as a community and as a society that we can hope to achieve. Moreover, the federal government has proved itself inept at solving many of these issues that we've charged it with. So Nock's critique of this transfer of power means that the best policy, and one which fundamentally changes our perspective on the way we view social responsibilities and goals. Only by transferring this social power back to individuals can restore this sense of duty to our social institutions and our communities, and allow everyone to support these public goods that we've grown accustomed to and that we think are important outside of government. So the best way to do this, I believe, is by moving funding away from the government and towards communal institutions in the forms of nonprofits. The idea I'm proposing today is radical if taken to its complete end, but would have incredible implications for our society. And I ask of you all to consider it with me. What if, instead of giving all federal income taxes to the government, we were able to give them to nonprofits? Whatever an individual owes in federal income taxes, they could, instead of sending to the IRS, they could just send in whatever amounts they cared about to nonprofits of their choosing. This would exclude payroll taxes, state income taxes, as well as all the other forms of taxes that we pay. So it would still be money to be paid for the basics, corporate taxes, etc., to pay for the basic forms of government that we can all agree on that we need. And of course, if people wanted to, they could always send that money to the IRS instead of a nonprofit. So if you think about it, if you make $100,000 a year and you owe $30,000 in taxes, you could just send checks to your favorite nonprofits, your charities, your churches, your synagogues, your schools, whatever it was, instead of giving that money to the IRS. And the benefits to society, as I'm sure we could all think about, would be outstanding and widespread. Every tax-paying individual would suddenly have the ability to pay for the causes and support that he cares about. He has the tax money that he has to pay, and instead of giving that to the IRS and charging them with the responsibility to do these things, he'd be able to give it to the nonprofits and the charities that he cared about the most. And of course, this would also democratize government spending, because people themselves are choosing what they care about, the American people. Once people have the funds themselves, they would be able to take responsibility for their own causes. And of course, certain things might be left out that we currently give access to in the federal government, but that itself would be responding to the democratic needs of the people. If people cared as a collective certain goals, then as a collective they would care about those things. They would send the money to those ends. And if they didn't, they would simply be left out, because that's a democratic way of using government spending. But it also creates a market and an environment where people suddenly view nonprofits as the essential institutions of our society, as they should be. There would be competition and organizations which monitor these organizations as they do now, but in a more fuller extent. And they would suddenly become the essential institutions of our society. Our communities would be rich and vibrant. We'd have access to support the arts, education, whatever you cared about, the poor, homelessness, all these important things that we care about in our society that the federal government currently does for us. So the government has expanded to cover every need in society. And if this is what people really want, then people will also end up covering these things as well. But this also sidesteps much of the debate that we have between liberals and conservatives when it comes to taxes in this country. Of course, it doesn't solve every problem in taxes. Many people would wonder, why don't we just lower taxes? But this is one proposal. But it doesn't aim to get rid of the public welfare and the public good that we've grown accustomed to. The social spending would still be there, but we're just replacing that social spending with nonprofit forms of it. Studies also show that nonprofits are almost always better at providing the same services, like reducing poverty, than the federal government is. The proximity of these nonprofits, the lack of bureaucracy, and the freedom of thought would make nonprofits perfectly capable of addressing all the nation's social spending needs. And of course, if we still find need for some of the essential responsibilities of government, like our defense budget, we have the tax money that we already have, as well as the states that could also pitch in to pay for other things, because there would still be taxes there. So people would spend more time discussing their favorite nonprofits, their causes that they really cared about, and less time bickering over politics or their favorite candidate, because these would be the responsibilities that they cared about. The competition for attention would create an industry of checks and balances on all the new institutions as well as the old institutions that we all care about. And most of all, we would feel invested in our communities and what they could produce, because we would have the money and the access and the resources to invest in them. And government, as Knox says, would cease to be the answer to all of our problems and the source of all of our social power, and the focus of all of our national attention. Instead, democratic and local institutions and private institutions would be charged with the responsibilities that we care about the most. Thank you.
Thank you. I was just going to say, I love the thinking you do Yeshiva proud, certainly, and I was going to recommend briefly that you, if you haven't seen it already, look at a piece that Randy Levine wrote. He's president of the Yankees a couple of weeks ago, touching on this area, not in the kind of detail that you've gone into. I guess my question would be, how does your proposition meld with John's proposition about the Southbury Training School? what happens to the least popular
Right.
programs that are out there, or that have the fewest or the least wealthy constituents?
Right, so that's a great question. I think that's the primary question that comes up. I'm lucky to have a lot of liberal friends, so we tend to think in this way. I think we think of the federal government, or any government, as the ones primarily in charge of all of these essential things, like John spoke about. But I think the idea of this is that when we think of the charities that hopefully many of us in this room think of, and the charities that are currently around the United States, people give to institutions that they care about, and the money is there. And my plan is about taking that money that we have and giving it back to people, to individuals. And there's plenty of money there to care for all of these things, right? Currently, there are a lot of institutions that don't have funding because people simply don't have the money to send that funding that way. So if we think about the Southbury Training School is an excellent use, I think many people would agree, of our resources, and that's why people currently give charity to many institutions like that. And if given the opportunity, which my plan would give people the opportunity, of course, I think institutions like that, not because they're less popular, but because they affect people that I think people in our society care about, it will just be done in a willing way. It will be done by people who want to give to those institutions, which I think is a little bit more of a free and democratic way to do so. But I think the end cause will be similar. I think the institutions that people care about in our society, which we all know we do, and I think is evidenced by the institutions that we care about now, would still be funded. Yeah.
This is very interesting. I raise money for a not-for-profit. We're here at an event of a not-for-profit. You run a not-for-profit, so, but the principle, it's not the concept, the principle of charity predates the U.S. tax code. And I'm curious, because this is more philosophical. This is a policy thing you're proposing. There will be a million devils in details. I don't want to get into that, but I sort of have it's a little gnawing about how charity is now dependent on a tax deduction. And do you think there is that issue in America?
Currently?
Yeah. I mean, this is the premise of your paper here.
Right.
You link charity to tax deductibility, essentially. So I think there's a downside to that. Do you think there's a downside to that?
I think there is a downside to that, but I think that the plan that I'm speaking of, the idea that I'm speaking of, makes up for that, because I think that when we think of charity, we think of responsibilities to our community, we think of responsibility to others, and that's why we give charity. This plan essentially does that, and I think in an even deeper way than we do now, because it really charges individuals with the responsibility to give that charity.
But let me just deal.
Sure.
Well, let's say a charity is the home in Southbury, but there's another charity, and I'm sure the people who are members of it think it's a charity. At least it's a not-for-profit. Take the train museum. Where is it, in East Haven? Yeah, I'm not to knock it. I've gone there. Trolley cars, etc.
Sure.
That's a passion for people. Who are you to say that that's not a charity, or so? What are the limitations on what charity is? Versus what a not-for-profit is?
Right. So I'm not actually speaking in exactly that way. I'm thinking of nonprofits as charities as really anything that's legally considered a nonprofit as we do today. Those are the endeavors that we care about in society. Those are the things. Some people view trains as important. Some people view schools as important. Some people think they're all important. Currently, we don't actually have access to fund all of those important things because we spend so much in taxes, and we give that burden over to the U.S. government to either support a trolley museum or not support it. So it's all dependent on bureaucrats, and all dependent on a essentially coercive system of voting and democracy. We give that power over to the government. So what I'm saying is, yeah, of course those things are important. All of those things are important, and it's up to the people to decide whether that's important. So my plan actually gives power away from the federal government in the form of taxes to the people themselves to say, if you believe in a trolley museum, here you go. You actually have the money now to believe in that and to support that if you'd like.
This is somewhat sort of long-ranging wind-up, but as all of us have tracked in recent years, the left, the affluent, much more than in the old days, is disproportionately now, the affluent is disproportionately left. And I'm just wondering how you would answer the objection that the left is fond of coercion, as we all know, and a lot of these 501c3s, our friends at Planned Parenthood and all the rest. You're going to end up, for example, with a lot of liberals, a lot of people who decide that's where they want to give their taxes, and then you're going to end up with a state that essentially a federal government where its primary power is to legislate. And I'm just wondering whether you see any problem down the road with these nonprofits that will be sort of left-leaning nonprofits making out like bandits through the efforts of the affluent left, and then less sort of trendy. You know what I mean? A lot of money going into sort of the trendy cause du leftist jour, and then the sort of less popular.
Right. I think that's an excellent question. But I think we as conservatives, and I think as Knock or Buckley would speak about, that's one of the problems of freedom, right? The problem of freedom is that we have to allow other people to do what they want. And that means that...
Bummer.
Sometimes it's a bummer. But what that means is that if there are leftists who become more affluent and plan on supporting causes that we in this room or some of us don't care about, that's all we can do, because we don't place all of the power in a coercive state that says these are the causes that we as a whole have to care about.
So we have to convert them.
So we'd have to convert them, yeah. Well, that's where you can give all your money, yeah. Maybe thanks for watching online now,
Time for a few questions from the audience. I think you have a hand over there.
Yes, a question kind of comparing the nonprofits to the debt situation with colleges. The more money we give to student loans, the more corrupt the college becomes and doesn't do what it's supposed to do. The more money we give to a nonprofit, they have been exposed many, many times of having a bureaucracy that gets highly, highly paid, and then just turns into a nightmare for us. And we have our school systems to which we give lots of tax money. They do nothing as far as giving the students the benefit of that money, but build their bureaucracy bigger and bigger, and they make hundreds of thousands of dollars and give nothing back to us. So how do you answer that with regard to what you're proposing?
I think that's a great question, but I think that one of the reasons those things happen is because we're not connected to the actual result. We're not connected to the policymakers, either in D.C. or sometimes in our own state. The reason why we have democratic elections is that we can hold our elected representatives responsible, right? But some of these things happen. This government largesse happens because we can't eventually hold these representatives responsible. So I think this idea is actually that because individuals themselves would be charged with these organizations, if you believe that your school is doing the best job in educating poor children, then you could give to them. If they don't, then you'll give it to someplace else, right? This is the natural market tendency that we all think of when we think of conservative policies. But because private nonprofits are doing this work, individuals will actually be able to decide where things could go and what's working best, and not a government bureaucrat who has his own interests or whatever other interests.
Final question, right?
Yeah, that was an excellent presentation. What I heard in several of the questions, and I'll ask you this, is there, or have you thought about a need for some sort of arbitrating body that would actually channel certain percentages of these gifts to needy organizations? My concern is that the 501c3 organizations literally are proliferating as we speak in this room. I mean, there are so many of them, as you said, the train, but more than that. We have the zoo, we have the, and there are some basic social needs that you are suggesting the individuals should assume responsibility for, but it seems somewhat chaotic with millions of individuals, donating large percentages of their taxes and so it seems like there needs more of an organizing structure.
Yeah, absolutely. So the current system we have now is we trust the government to find those small nonprofits taking care of the causes that we either don't have time or couldn't have known about either way. And the reason why I think this idea is really, it's a pretty broad idea, as you identified. It could still be in its infancy. But I think that what it does is it sort of structures the way we normally think about the causes that we care about and the way we think about society and the power that we hold in society. So currently we'd say, yeah, of course, the federal government is in charge of all those things, and they're the ones who find all of those people. What this does and says, yeah, of course, what we now have is our own issues of finding those things, but the problem is solved in the same way, right? We in this room, of course, would want to find those organizations that we wouldn't normally think about, and there are many do-gooders in America. People give charity all the time. People care about those organizations. So there'll be new organizations that come up with finding those small spots that many of us would not see, right? Because if we in a community have the money and have the resources to care about those things, and our minds are in their way, which I think we are as a society, then we will invest in the things that will allow us to take care of those things, just done in a non-coercive and non-centralized way. And I think that actually it will yield better results, one, because it's privatized and there's a market for it, but also because everyone's invested, right? So if 300 or however many hundreds of millions of tax-paying Americans are now invested in that system, I would think that actually there are more benefits to the person who is forgotten than it is if only someone in DC thinks about those things. So, thank you very much.